5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for
5,
Radical
4,
Particularities of
3,
Care.
2,
This virtual
1.
event brings together the writer Maggie Nelson
Hello, everyone.
and the artist Mark
Thank you for
Swanson
joining
for a
us
night
this
of
evening.
conversation
5,
on the
4,
occasion Maggie Nelson's
3,
recently published
2,
book. This virtual
1.
event
Freedom
brings together the
for
writer
songs
Maggie
of
Nelson
care.
and the
Everyone,
artist Mark
thank you for
Swanson
joining
for a
us
night
this
of
evening.
memorial of the
3,
recently published
2,
this
of the
virtual
dead
event
freedom
brings together the
for
writer
songs.
Maggie
Tonight
Nelson
also
and the
marks the
artist
launch
Thank you
of
for
Hiking
joining
for a
us
Night
this
of
healing
Healing.
through burdens of care.
Memorial
This virtual event brings together the writer Maggie
Tonight also
Nelson
marks the
and
launch
Thank you
of
for
Hiking
joining
for a
us
Night
this
of
healing
Healing.
through burdens of care.
Memorial of
My name is
This
Deborah
virtual
Deborah, and I'm Assistant Professor of English at Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts and co-director of Care Syllabus. Motivated by a series of pressing critical inquiries, Care Syllabus aims to generate justice-centered discourse in a time of unrest and uncertainty. In a digital age that simultaneously lends itself to isolation as well as alternative forms of world-making, Care Syllabus tends to artistic expression, activism, and thinking that fosters radical communal imagination. The creative impulses rooted in these modes of collaboration and critique spur new ways of investigating, revaluing, and celebrating the histories of care and shifting praxis of care currently at work in our homes, classrooms, and communities. With gratitude and humility, we acknowledge that Care Syllabus's hosting institutions, Mass MoCA and MCLA, rest on the ancestral homelands of the Wapanaki Confederacy and the Mohican people. Tonight, we are thrilled to bring together Maggie Nelson and Mark Swanson to draw attention to particularities of care as they arise in nuanced relation to the labors and limits of artistic creation and interpretation. When the rally cry of care sounds far and wide, where do we focus our energies? What role, if any, might art and artistic engagement play in navigating our capacities to give and receive care? In their discussion, Nelson and Swanson will touch on shared investments evident in their recent works, which explore connections between queer experience, alternative understandings of time, and climate crisis. Following this evening's event, I invite you to check out the new accompanying module of Care Syllabus, in which members of the project's advisory collective have assembled an array of contributions to touch upon various textures of refusal that take a cue from Nelson's work in On Freedom. In a moment, I will turn it over to Denise Marconish, Senior Curator and Director of Exhibitions at Mass MoCA, to introduce Maggie and Mark. But first, a few important notes. As you should see, this event is utilizing automated live captioning. The first portion of the event will feature Maggie and Mark in conversation, and then we will move to a public Q&A. We've been collecting some questions through our RSVP form for this event, and you're also invited to submit a question in real time in the comments. Following the event, if you have further questions, you're invited to drop into a private Zoom room with Maggie and Mark, who have generously offered to stick around for a bit more of an informal discussion. If you'd like the link to this Zoom room, please email info@caresyllabus.org. Last but certainly not least, we'd like to thank the Northern Berkshire Cultural Council and the Mass Cultural Council for their support of this evening's programming and its accompanying module. And now I will pass it to Denise.
Thank you, Vicki. I'm Denise Marconish, as Vicki said, Senior Curator and Director of Exhibitions here at Mass MoCA. And I've been working for, the past 5 years or so with Mark Swanson, even though this show is about 18 years in the making of our friendship and connection as artist and curator. So I'm really thrilled that we could put this panel together. I'm usually not one to rattle off things in an intro, so I'm going to wing it a little bit. But, I will say a couple of years ago when Mark and I were talking about this show, we were having a conversation with two friends, Susanna Saylor and Edward Morris, who run a project called Toolshed at the Basilica in Hudson. And they said, Maggie Nelson's working on something about climate change, as we were talking about Mark's ideas around his show. And so immediately then we waited with bated breath for On Freedom to come out. Maggie needs almost no introduction. She is well known for her books like The Argonauts, The Art of Cruelty, personal favorite of mine, Bluets, She has won a MacArthur Foundation Award, Creative Capital, Andy Warhol Foundation, the Guggenheim, the NEA. And her newest book on freedom really explores how we think about experience, and talk about the idea of freedom and its complexities through 4 topics: art, sex, drugs, and climate. Mark is an internationally exhibiting artist. He was in the 2005 Greater New York exhibition at PS1. He's in numerous public collections like the Smithsonian, the Whitney Museum, the National Museum of Australia. And his exhibition, A Memorial to Ice at the Dead Deer Disco, opened just a little over a week ago. So we're all still reeling from that a little bit, as it opened in the midst of a big snowstorm, which somehow seemed appropriate, as all of Mark's exhibition is sort of dripping with sculptural icicles. And the exhibition really looks at the alignment between climate change and the AIDS crisis as these 2 sort of hyper objects that are almost too big to wrap our arms around. Mark's show will be up here through December, and there'll also be a companion exhibition that will open at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site in July. I'm just going to end with a quote that I think will be a good start off to this conversation from Maggie's book. It says, "Art has long served as a place for people to act out what they want and think about stuff that they want to be thinking about. It has long been a place to engage in open-ended experiments with extremity, wildness, satire, defiance, taboo, beauty, and absurdity, to make space for anarchic gestures and urges that might otherwise rip apart, for better or worse, social norms or fabric. To some of us, it offers magic hard to come by elsewhere, and which we can make life feel more worth living." So I think that is what both of these thinkers and artists who are about to share your screen do. So handing it over to Mark and Maggie.
Wow, that makes art sound pretty great. This is that weird moment where I just get to see Mark and we don't see you, but we're thrilled to be here. I'm going to make Mark the speaker so I don't look at myself. Great. Hi, Mark. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you? And thank you, Denise. That was a wonderful introduction. And thank you, Vicki. Yeah, I'm so still not used to these little sort of distended boxes that we are in, but it's exciting to be here and I'm excited for tonight. How are you doing, Maggie?
I'm doing great. I'm super excited too. I really wish I were there and had just seen the show, but maybe for one of the first times in a long time, I feel like, because it's up till January 2023, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe for the first time in a long time, I feel like I will see the show. I feel hope and faith. And so, you know, we can talk again after, but huge congratulations. I hope it was a decent install experience.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was almost a month, and so it was a bit of a bear. And then we had as Denise said, we had a true bomb cyclone for for the opening, and it was 55 the day before and a beautiful day the day after. So we got a bit of climate crisis thrown in with it too. So.
Well, it's only 88 degrees here in LA today. So if I'm looking red, it's because it's a record high. No surprise. I mean, there's so much, Mark, that we can talk about, and I know that we have other people here that will want to talk with us, and I want to talk with them. And we've had a little chance to talk before about things that might be of crossover interest, but really I feel like nearly everything might seem like a crossover interest. So I don't know. I thought I would just start by asking a question about, again, like I haven't seen the show, so study as I have the images online, I sadly won't be able to pepper my conversation with visceral accounts of texture and scale. But I will say that in reading about, in the pamphlet and about the kind of foundational idea about AIDS and climate change, there was this part in the pamphlet that I thought was super interesting that talked about discos being haunted by like the specter of AIDS, and then the woods being haunted by the specter of climate change. And there's this kind of line about like after a big night of dancing, one might, inspect one's skin for Kaposi sarcoma and that kind of haunting. And I just wondered if, in thinking about the show, and maybe even if you want to extend it to making the objects, I'm thinking about how like in their individual sense about AIDS or about climate change, the hauntings always seem so preventable and so catastrophic. And so, but in the kind of like conceptual or spiritual sense, like there's a way that of course these two things would come together always. Like what experience of like ecstatic release could not be haunted by a feeling of anxiety, or what experience doesn't have like a kind of morning after to it. So I'm just kind of curious as to what that relationship between comfort and loss or sorrow, again, both you've thought about conceptually, but also maybe even in making the objects, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I should start by saying, as we did talk briefly before, and I love On Freedom so much, and I felt very cared for actually reading that book. I sort of said to someone I felt a bit swaddled by it, and I listened to it. I'm dyslexic, so I listened to it on an audio tape, and it was like truly a page turner. I couldn't stop listening. So I'll just put that in there. But yeah, I had gone to a residency here in the woods that up in the Catskills, not too close from my house. Not too far from my house, that didn't have running water. It was heated with wood, and I went in September, and it was cold, and so it was above a waterfall, and every morning I would go down and take like a big pot, 2 big pots, and boil one for water and one to clean with and to bathe with. And I got really very connected to my surroundings, and I spent most of the time not making any artwork, but just would kind of hike all day long and spent time in the woods. And that was this moment where I felt so present, so spiritually connected. And I think the sort of needing to like worry all day long about like how I was going to figure out how to use the outhouse if it was freezing, and like how to bathe and how to feed myself and how to wash things without running water and all this stuff just brought me very, very close to sort of it all kind of came together. And I just had this moment where I felt like, oh, I feel so connected, more connected than I ever have anywhere. And then when I got back, but there was a sense of deja vu. And when I got back, I realized it was this, but I was pulled out of that in the specter of climate change. I would sort of be like really sort of be thinking, oh my God, how long is this going to last? And what part am I doing in this? And even in this thing, I brought bottled water, and I was all, and I had this deja vu moment, and I realized when I got back that it was so similar to the nightclubs when I turned 18. And at that time, the Gay Men's Health Crisis, I remember getting a pamphlet, and they said the only known forms of safe sex were dry kissing and masturbation with gloves. And that was the only thing. So what I did when I sort of figured this, when these two things came together, I thought, well, there's no way this can work. There's no way I can sort of conflate climate change and AIDS, and started to work on this project. And the way I worked about it in the studio was I just really, probably for the first time, was really able, because I was so, I think, nervous about where it was going and how could I even begin to approach these two things properly, But I knew I had to start with sort of my own lived experience and move into it in a way that I just had to kind of like follow my nose and go at things and sort of wait for things to be revealed, and then kind of like help them grow and kind of massage them into place and meditate. Like I couldn't really force them into a space. So it felt like actually someone did a studio visit and said these pieces feel very cared for. I really left them and they kind of came together in that way. So I'm not sure if that's what you were asking, but I felt I had to be very careful, but also really be true to how I felt about it, and creating also a memorial within that felt like a heavy responsibility, but also the only way through was just to be sort of as honest and clear as possible while keeping things open enough that people could enter it themselves.
Did that make you feel like, I mean, not that you would deduce a credo from it, but does working like as honestly as possible, or like following your intuition as much as possible, does that feel to you like that kind of is a form of care, that even if it would seem to, like, no matter what it seemed like to anybody else, like that kind of honesty is the practice in a way, you know?
Yeah, I felt it was, I don't know. I think there's something about, there was so much shame at the time associated with AIDS that I was working with these things and sort of building these things that were working as memorials. And I had literally like pictures of one night of the nightclub when I worked there. And I felt like I just had to be so careful, but also realize that there was so much shame and everything was people were so overwhelmed, and there were so many funerals and there was so much kind of erasure happening, that I was really doing this work for me that I hadn't really like seen a lot of, just sort of really putting it together in that way. And I felt very much like I had to be very careful and very respectful, and also bring in a theatrical sense to give a sort of a theatrical distance to be able to deal with something that well. And also obviously within the queer communities, like theatricality and theatrical distance has been a device used, not only in all kinds of forms, but within the discos themselves, And so I think it's sort of I think the different way that came about working was that I let things sort of be where they were, and then would like leave them for a couple months and then kind of come back to them. And instead of feeling, I've let them feel really vulnerable, instead of feeling like I had to sort of finish them and make them sort of be, they just felt like they were already there in a certain way, if that makes sense.
The sculptures, like the forms themselves, that you would leave them be a little bit where you'd last left them.
Yeah, I would sort of put together these rough drafts with cable ties and just kind of like bang things together with screws and scrap wood and sort of put them as a sketch. And those things would be things that I would feel probably too vulnerable in the past to leave as is, to kind of leave in that sort of immediate form. And they just kind of would speak through that, and then I would just kind of adjust them a little bit here and there, a lot differently than I had in the past.
It's really interesting.
But there was a sense that I just, the caring part, it just, like I said, I felt like I had to be really, really careful, but then also really, really, I don't know if honest. I think I've always been honest in my work, but not protective. I had to just kind of like be really vulnerable within it and put that out there to express sort of the vulnerability of both, I think, what it was like then for people, and also now where we're in such a vulnerable state, but also working with these very, very traumatic things in a space that sort of is to give you space to deal with that kind of trauma, I think, and be there with it.
And when you talk about like wanting to be really careful, do you think of that as like did you have an object of what you were being careful to, like careful to the memory of the dead, or careful to like the imagined interlocutors, or like careful of like of yourself, or I don't know, I'm just curious like if it had an object.
I think in a way it was more being careful about sort of not letting any sort of like kind of the art market enter it all. Do you know what I mean? Not sort of trying really hard not to think about sort of like a criticality, like not like trying to just stay really in conversation with the work itself, and not be having these hypothetical conversations of how it may be perceived or what it would actually function as, but sort of create something that I felt people could be with in a way that wouldn't sort of get in their way, but would be able to, I guess, be very autobiographical, but also in a way that wouldn't feel hermetic, I guess.
Do you think that so I don't know how much we should tell our phantom viewers. There's only on our screen it says 7 participants, so we know that there are more of you out there, but I don't know how much we should tell them about. But if you want to talk about Thomas Cole stuff at all, but I was interested in your observations about in working upstate and in working on property or with landscapes that Cole had frequented and favored. That you had this line about that if he were back, that he would be happy to see the deindustrialization that of the area in a way that was different than maybe what he feared, but probably sad about the global state of ecological affairs. And it made me think about just this whole thought experiment that you've been doing about like if Cole came back and what, but it made me think a lot also about, when I was a student of like the American Renaissance or whatever, like, through like Stanley Cavell and other things, we were kind of always taught that like, to remember that like when Thoreau went to Walden, like Walden was already lost, or that like when like my teacher in college, Annie Dillard, wrote Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, she made a lot of effort to talk about that there were like beer cans under every bush and a highway right nearby, and that yet still she was having this, and both Thoreau and Dillard after him had this kind of idea of like, it's whether you are looking and seeing and not necessarily the state of pristineness of the thing in front of you, this kind of like reverence of the active attention, because of course, like, as Dillard says, like, nature, like, in a suburban yard, if you get down on your knees and close down enough, you're going to find a lot of activity, whether it's with the ants or whatever. But I was just curious about this notion of the kind of already lost or like the fallen Eden, and its relationship also to like the future. So whenever anyone says like, oh, the children now are living in the ruins of, our dreams, or, a line like I bring up in my book, like, I have children and the children don't care about the ruins of our ruins. They care about living now, and they're not like, they're like, whatever you guys saying how it used to be here, like this is our first go time. So I'm just curious as to what, that sense of memorial you've thought so much about and made. I'm bringing up many different things, but how you think about both the kind of fallen Eden narrative, and then also this notion of kind of a futurity that can't be foreclosed, no matter how foreclosed we may think that it is,
Well, I think it's really funny that I had read Walden Pond again recently, and then there was I had never caught this before, but Thoreau's complaining about the noise of the horses and the carriages going by. And he like talking about how heavy the traffic is and that he can hear them from where he is. Yeah, I think that I think part of the exhibition and part of my thinking was really about this difference between sort of being in the moment and sort of being, and part of what I did when I was on that residency was I had zoomed in and started taking videos of very small things that were happening, sort of with water dripping or a feather, in the wind, or a leaf blowing in the wind. And that is actually what brought me so connected to be like at this really small level with things. So I think that dichotomy is something I tried to sort of set up within the sort of disco and this thing that like I had a wonderful time at those places. It was amazing. It was like I had just come out of the closet. It was this incredible release, like queer people ran these worlds as far as I could tell. And things like, structural racism, homophobia, all those things still existed there, but they were way better than anywhere else. It was like what I could find. And so I think comparing it to that Cole moment of sort of like that everything was clear cut here, everything was being developed. I think the notion that Thomas Cole Catskill has 3,500 people and we have 2 stoplights, and I think Cole would probably have the impression that now it would be the size of like New York City because of the rapid developments going on now, but it's actually smaller than it was then. There's way less here than there was then. And so I think that kind of, moment is so interesting in this kind of way where it is this sort of like the hyper object and sort of how do we live our lives within this, how do we move forward? And I think Tim Morton has some really interesting things talking about that and the disco and, and sort of being in that place of the moment. And I think, I think part of the reason I loved your book so much is, and I think it's partly the dyslexia, is I have to sort of like take things in really holistically. I have to kind of like pull from a bunch of different sources, and the way you're working with sort of very high theory and academia down to like friends' anecdotes to like this very, for lack of a better, sort of high and low and sort of grasping from other places and bringing in pop culture and sort of forming these things. That's how I feel like I work with things, like sort of I'm experiencing things. So we, my partner Joe and I had bought a property when we moved up here, and we realized that Thomas Cole actually was his favorite place to paint in one of our backyard, and spent a lot of time here. So I just sort of followed my nose with Cole as well. And that sort of led to this whole thing, and then learned that Cole was a proto-environmentalist and that his dad was literally a Luddite. And so was here. The reason he was so upset about what was happening here is because he came from England and saw it already happen there. The Industrial Revolution, they were literally outrunning the Industrial Revolution because they were decorative artists, his parents. But I think, I guess in a certain way, like, you do a similar thing, right? When you're talking, like, you're sort of zeroing in on these very specific moments, but sort of bringing in these much bigger things from other realms that kind of inform it. But, how does that operate in this moment at this time, and sort of bring in these ideas of, I think, space within that to sort of walk around within it and kind of feel a bit suspended so you can come to your own conclusion, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense.
I like the way that you bring up, like, the way you think, or dyslexia, or like the way that you read, or the kind of way in which holistic thinking is important, just because I think often, I don't know, I think about this a lot, like as a writer, that, not that we all have one talent or like one thing that we do, but we do have a way of seeing, or like metabolizing, I guess, the world that, in the moment we find ourselves in. And I think that, like I'm a very, like magpie, like how does this look next to this? Like how many different things can we bring together here, kind of a person, and kind of like imagining, like, I think in my book Bluets, I was talking about it like a bower bird, but I always do think of, I think of different, I think more of sculptural metaphor than I think of literary genre, which I think is probably part of the reason why I like sculptors, is that like I understand this kind of idea of like you're making a nest with different textures or different things. And I think definitely, but I wonder, too, just to kind of touch on the notion of care, like, oh, great, look at these, like, this is a good piece to talk about care. But just the way that, the act of bringing things together can be very, like with AIDS and climate change, but, there's a lot of, like in my chapter about the climate, beginning with talking about my son enjoying trains, and then kind of, going, kind of scoping way out to look at the role of the steam engine. There's, I wouldn't say carefully is the word I would use, but like, I feel like, to me, I think of it as more like, if it's not done, well. Like if I didn't aesthetically realize the project, it's not the nature of the comparison that's the problem. You could compare anything and have it be right. It's just like how well you do it, like how well you make the connection, I guess.
I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, maybe that is partly what I'm saying about being careful, is to not sort of like push these things into any place, and sort of, I guess it is sort of saying, staying in this place till they work,
Yeah. Yeah.
where maybe in the past I feel like I was more trying to illustrate an idea, or like convey something particular,
Mhm.
that this just kind of felt very additive in a way, and careful. I think I meant careful in this way of like just being careful to the work itself,
Yeah. Yeah.
and also careful about the subject matter of sort of not wanting to bring in too, I didn't want to lock anything down too much that would sort of like put it in any, like I feel like there's, I don't want to like, I want to like sort of ask questions, and rather than answer them, I think in a certain way, and sort of let people, I don't know, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we
But
can talk about images from the show, but I just think that's a really interesting reframe, only in that, like, say in my teaching life, I would say that when most people talk about proceeding carefully, they're actually thinking of it as the reverse of what you mean. They're thinking about worrying about what other people think. And then you just kind of, when you were talking before about the art market and its concerns and like criticality, you were actually talking about taking care not to have those things play the central role in the work. I think it's a really interesting reversal.
I think part of the whole thing is moving up here 8 years ago from New York City. I mean, being an artist there, I felt like you kind of get like plopped on a conveyor belt, and you sort of are moving to bigger, you're moving forward really fast, and it's like bigger and better, or you get knocked off, and it's like
Right.
one or the other, and you
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
even kind of realize it's happening. And
Yeah.
when I moved up here, it was just this whole different thing, and I felt like I was actually molting this sort of like exoskeleton that I had sort of grown to deal with it, and felt very extremely vulnerable. And so like this work, I was just also careful and not really like showing it to a lot of people. I mean, I think I was maybe tentative or something in a certain way too. And then also felt, I think in the past I had sort of treated my creativity a little bit more like a pack horse,
Mhm.
and sort of like maybe a self-esteem machine, and like an ATM machine, and all these other things, where I'm learned up here, I just wanted to sort of plant these seeds. I don't mean to sound too, but like sort of plant these seeds, and let them grow, and sort of tend to them, and give them light and water, and kind of let them
Mhm.
like get to a place of harvest, rather than sort of like, shooting them with Roundup so I could hack them down fast enough. You know what I mean? To
Yeah,
force them
no, I
into
think it's
something.
really important. I mean, I'm a really private writer too. Like my partner always jokes that like I will like lie and not say I'm writing a book and like work feverishly, and then like because I'm like dying to come out like 1 to 5 years later and be like, okay, here it is, but like but it's actually very true. But it's in part, I think, because of what you're describing, which is just that I just don't. I don't know. Often I feel like I'm trying to do something kind of hard, and I don't really want to hear anyone tell me that it can't be done, or like what its
Hmm.
pitfalls are. I'm like, I'll find them all on my
Hmm.
way. But if I hear about them from you, then I might internalize a message of like yellow or red lighting, or I might
Hmm.
internalize a message of like, I don't know. Like, I mean, it's more just, I mean, this is kind of cliche, but it's just more, kind of flat out self-protection. And I actually weirdly think a lot of On Freedom was written about that, because I think that these modalities that artists use, I don't know if I put myself in that category exactly, but the ways that we have to protect the conditions by which we undertake these investigations can be kind of stymieing to those intimate and those afar, and yet critics and everybody else who loves to talk about work, like and maybe even impugn some of these procedures. They're the ones that they many of them are kind of like the idiosyncratic conditions of possibility that enable one to stick with making throughout a life.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that because like with sculpture, I I don't have the option of being by myself a lot of the time. Like things I can't make it alone. Like
How
it's
horrifying.
I need a
Yeah,
second set of
right.
hands. But I'm like the total opposite with my partner, Joe Mama Nitzberg, who's an artist and himself and like a great artist. And I so trust his opinions. I mean, in certain ways, I am like careful when things are too early, but I'm probably more the type that's like if they're not here, I'm like on FaceTime because I can't even
Right.
wait to get home. Or I'm like
Right.
I'm like, okay, it's can you come tonight and see this thing? Like I get so nervous, like, and I'm always looking for that sort of recognition from them. You know, I don't want it from other people, but
Right.
I always tell the story when we first started dating. We're a few weeks in, and Joe came to the studio, which is, you know, a big moment. And he said, as we walked in, like, do you want me to be really honest? And I said, please, brutally honest. And Joe walked in and looked around for, you know, a little bit, said something, and he said, okay, well, here it comes. And he said, this I love. And he turned around and he said, this I hate. And I was like, this, I got it. You know, this is what I
This
want.
is what you wanted.
This is
Right?
what I
Yeah.
want. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he looked
Yeah,
at me kind of like, is that okay? And I was like, yes, thank you. You know, so I really, you know, I feel like I've always sort of worked closely with a couple real confidants of artists or writers or musicians that I've always been a little insecure. So need that as I go along, but I'm getting better.
Well, I think it's possible that objects look better than sentences in progress. You know, like a thought
Well,
that
yeah.
really hasn't been thought yet in sentences is just really nothing at all. You know, it's
Mm-hmm,
just like it's
mm-hmm.
just you know, cliched runs of words that haven't yet been cleaned up, you know, so I don't know. But I don't know if you want, do we want to, we can talk about these images if we want. We can talk about, you know, we were going to talk about the public sculpture that was vandalized. Like we have, then there's Q&A. I don't know, whatever. I don't know what you want to do or what our people want us to do. Maybe we have about like 5 or 6 more minutes with us, I guess, Mark. What do you think?
I mean, in a certain way, I was really interested in what we were talking about when we talked, you know, a few weeks
Yeah.
ago about sort of about that responsibility and care that comes after, you know, like you put so much care. I mean, the insane, I can't even, the research you did for this book, I can't even imagine. It would literally kill me. But like, you know, to me, the care put into like leaving no stone unturned for then to be sort of given to me in this really clear way. And I don't know, in the audio book, I'm not sure if it's like this I didn't actually look, but in the audio book, as you cite anything you cite, it says it right when it's happening.
Oh,
Like
wow. No, yeah.
it says the footnote while you're happening, which for me was like
Weird,
a dream,
right.
which for me was like a dream. Because that's like that's exactly how I'd like to have it because I get so lost. And so it was amazing. But this kind of idea, and so the thing that popped up in my head was this public sculpture that I think, Levy, there's maybe you have a picture of it. This is from 2004. On the right, it was installed in Metrotech and commissioned by the Public Art Fund in New York. And then on the left, it's at DePaul University in Greencastle, Indiana. And so I put these both up because context is everything. And so we were talking about sort of the responsibility of the artist, and you know, when we put things into the world, and is that sort of the work in itself, and is the care that goes into that. And so I'll just try and quickly, you know, this is kind of a long story, so I'll try and quickly do it. But suffice to say, it was in Brooklyn for a year and wasn't damaged, and it was bought by DePaul University, which is a small sort of private liberal arts university in Indiana. And about a week into it, they called me and said that the tip of one of the antlers came off, and could I ask them how to, and could I tell them how to fix it? And they had told me when they bought it, like, this is perfect, the students will love this. It's like someone had endowed them with a big gift to like put public sculpture on campus. And then they called me like a week later and said there was some damage to the legs. And then they called me, a week later and said, it was this strange thing where I was like, this is the first public sculpture I ever made. I didn't know what was happening. Like maybe I didn't make it correctly and the molds hadn't worked out right. And then like in rapid fire, all these things happened. And then finally they called me and said, after the first time I said, how do the students like it? And they said, oh, well, they got really quiet and they said, well, it's really starting a lot of conversations or something like that. It was like this strange thing.
Right.
It definitely wasn't like, oh, they loved it just like we thought. And so it turned out like 3 weeks after being up, it had to be removed because it was one of the antlers had been sawed off, one of the legs, it had been like smashed with a baseball bat and all this stuff. And it had been vandalized. And so to the point where they had to remove it because it was getting so destroyed. And I had this strange thing where people were like, oh, you must be so upset. And I actually didn't take it personally and I didn't really care about it was more interesting to me, the context.
Mhm.
And they finally, in that point, came clean and they sent me all these things from the student newspaper and all these other places. And it was like this really surprisingly very violent rhetoric around what it was. Like it should be shot like a real deer. It should be tossed, very misogynist. I won't go into the details, but just, it should be thrown out, it should be killed, it should be thrown in the dumpster, it should just go away. It was not appropriate. That over and over again, they were very upset that they hadn't been asked. And what it turned out to be was the sort of like clear end was that it was too close. It had been installed too close to the fraternities and too close to the athletic center. That was the idea. And they said if it had been installed closer to the arts building, maybe that would have been okay. So it was this thing, but everyone kind of hated it. It was this very weird thing. And I was shocked and they sent me, local newspaper articles. And then it became this like huge thing when it got removed. And so I'll try just to condense the whole thing. I was eventually told by an older faculty member that they had never had any problems during the civil rights movement. They had never had any problems during Vietnam, that this was the biggest thing that ever happened on their campus. Like they had never had any kind of like protests or things like this happen. So it was a huge deal to them. And I was scheduled to do a talk and I called, they said, we still want you to come talk about your work. And I said, well, how am I going to talk about my work? It's just going to be about this. And they said, yeah, it probably is. And then these things started happening of like who was responsible, why it happened. The administration was sort of saying boys will be boys. They were sort of saying homophobia and this and that. And they kept asking me, what did I think it was? And then I kind of got this thing. They were like, great, when you come, it'll be really good for them to hear that. It'll be really good. And I started getting very uncomfortable because I was not familiar with this community at all. I had no idea what their campus life was like. And they were sort of saying like, you will define what happened here. And I was like, I felt really uncomfortable and I was like, that's the work I think you need to do. And they were trying to have these seminars.
Mhm.
Long story short, my dad had asked me not to come, I think because of Matthew Shepard and his experience in the Marines and other things. He really was very uncomfortable with me being in rural places. And especially there was so much violent rhetoric around this. He was afraid I was going to be hurt. And so I told them I was going to go, wasn't coming, and they were very upset about it. And the way this played out, like more and more, it was this whole thing that they were very upset that I couldn't come to sort of define what had happened. And they kept asking me to come and kept kind of offering more money. And I didn't even know why, but I was incredibly resistant
Mhm.
because I felt like the work had already been done and the work spoke for itself. And I was happy to know it was a powerful piece in a way that got this reaction.
Mhm.
But I didn't feel like it was my job to then go sort out what was happening on their campus and why it happened,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So sorry to sort of run through that, but yeah, so I think that was like a real learning experience for me. One, what people bring to public sculpture and context and where it is, and sort of what the responsibility of the artist is after something leaves, and what they think about something because I couldn't figure out why what I thought about it made any sense really.
Right. But
For
now,
them.
how have you, I wonder, I'm so curious, Mark. I mean, I think this story is so fascinating, and I mean, it scarcely matters what I think, but just for the sake of talking, I'm so glad that you honored your desire not to go, you know, and I think, and I'm curious because this kind of, you know, maybe in a kind of reverse fashion, whereas in your case, it might have been like you were supposed to go and define something as homophobic or shame somebody or say art should be protected or whatever. But in a kind of reverse fashion, you know, in the last, you know, decade or so, it's been, you know, more often kind of like a demand for an artist to show up to kind of like defend the work, you know, defend the work otherwise, you know, like from its detractors. And I also have a similar feeling where I don't really see why, you know, I think that I think we share a kind of, you know, I don't know what you want to call it. I wouldn't even call it like an ethos. It's just kind of like a feeling that the work is the art, and that people's feelings about it. It's not that the artist can't get into the mix, but that the idea that that there need be a demand for them to do so, you know, or something ethical is being shirked seems kind of, it just strikes me as odd. As well. And I just wonder over the years how if you've stayed equally happy with your decision and felt or thought about it more and more, or like how has it kind of come down over the last decade, or I guess longer even, right? 20 years almost.
Yeah, I mean, it's 2005 when it went there. I mean, I went to the school at the 10th year anniversary. They had me back, and I from talking to them then, there was still people that were miffed at me for not coming, and I was actually still very glad I didn't go in a certain way. And they did do all these seminars and work about it, and their school did work on it in a way that I think would probably be more productive, because I think when I came there I would just shut down the discussion. I think the whole point was for me to shut down the discussion and tell everybody, and I didn't want to tell anybody. And for me, I think it's just sort of, I'm almost more allergic to it than anything else. You know, I mean, I have my opinions. The other thing that I forgot to say is the other thing that happened to it was incredibly like sexual too. They would call it disco deer, which I thought made it kind of, and people would get drunk and ride it naked and pretend they were having sex with it or oral sex with it. And this is how I found out about Facebook, because it was it was all being shared on a Facebook page. But that's how it got damaged too, from people doing that. So it was also, I was also just very curious to see how it play out. Like if they could sort of, I didn't want to shut down the conversation because I was also really curious about the combination of like sexual violence that was being talked about, and violence, and how this was all coming together. And really part of it honestly was like, I was sort of wanted more to be revealed about what was happening there. And I felt like I would end the conversation because I was basically being told that's what would happen in a good way.
I mean, were you curious? I'm curious just in looking at the pictures, and you talked about context. So one of them is like, has a fence and one does not. Although I don't know how much that work was doing, but I mean, was part of you curious, even though it was potentially, you know, I don't know if I'd say derogatory, but like, you know, but were you curious from a kind of object relations point of view of just like what this object incited people to do in terms of touching it? Like would it be interesting to you to not have it? Because I noticed with that gate, like I would imagine the message would be, this is art, you can't touch it. But if it was on a college campus, not. I mean, you know, I teach at USC where we have, you know, Tommy Trojan, who, you know, no end of things are done with Tommy Trojan. You know what I mean? Like, because it's just right there. There's no, it's not walled off, and it's like it's like it almost like invites you know, interaction in a way, you know.
I don't know what the deal was with this. When I was installing this in Brooklyn, this like group of men all in business suits came up to me in this very sort of aggressive way. I felt protected because I was behind the fence, but it felt very familiar to like junior high sort of bullying. And these guys came up to me and they like said like, is that yours? Did you make that? It was this very confrontational thing. And I said, yes. And basically it boiled down to that they told me that they thought the sort of, because the like ass was sticking in the air and the tail was flipped up, they thought I was doing this on purpose and pointing it towards a branch of the New York Stock Exchange that was in the one of the office buildings right there. And I sort of explained to them that I had no idea there was a branch of the Brooklyn Stock Exchange there, and it had nothing. They thought it was a comment on money and sort of wealth, and so it was just what I'm saying is the reason I'm bringing that up is because I was amazed what people would bring to this. Like I felt like it was just such a perfect example of why I can't control at all what happens with art afterwards, because people bring their own things to it and then somehow try and imbibe it with that. And so I don't know how I could compete with that. This fenced off area, it was in downtown Brooklyn, but it did have 24-hour security. And I was told by someone in the know that the security guards liked the work, so they would protect it. And the part of the public art fund pieces they didn't like, they would turn a blind eye if people were going to vandalize them. So that was what I was told.
And did you feel, I mean, this last question I'll ask you, I don't know if we're supposed to move on, but like, did you feel like, how did you imagine the ghost of, or maybe even the form of this piece? Like, how would you say it is alive in the show that you just installed, you know?
Well, there is, I made this rhinestone work starting in my mid-20s when I lived in San Francisco, and it's very much about my dad and these personal things. And but in this show, I don't have it here, but about 10 feet in the back, in the sort of more disco part, there's about 10 feet of rhinestone antlers hanging and turning with a disco ball motor, and they're lit and silhouetted, but instead of them reflecting light into the room, they themselves sort of sparkle in it. And I think that's probably the ghost of those in there. But there's also many deer forms, as you can see. There's a taxidermy forms, and that was as well. And so I use the forms quite a bit in the show, but without any adornment. And I think that's part of what I was saying about being sort of true to the, I don't know, the brutality of sort of what things are now too, and also the vulnerability. Deer's always represented a kind of innocence to me. So, but
Maggie and Mark, I'm jumping back in here.
Yeah, and I bet people are frustrated we didn't talk about the book more. Or not, maybe not.
Well, I'm jumping back in with questions we have from people watching and people who submitted when they registered for the event. And thank you so much for this discussion. I also was sort of creating my own questions as we went along. And so I'm going to sort of start there, but it's also a spin off a question from somebody watching who asked, do you ever feel exhausted by art? How do you keep yourselves open to the creative experience when you are feeling fatigue from from creative expressions and the institutions around you? And I was thinking, like, you know, in this conversation, particularly Mark, around this experience that you've been describing with a sculpture at the university, you know, this idea of like the self who creates and the way that the self is, you know, infused within one's own creative practice, and then the self that is the artist that you know, attends to the art in the aftermath of it, sort of being out there in the world, and this idea of exhaustion. And also, Mark, at some point you had mentioned this, I think, speaking of your younger self, this idea of like creativity as like an ATM machine that maybe one could, like, you know, keep taking out of. And Maggie, in On Freedom, you talk about this notion of an economy of care. So I guess I'm sort of spinning this to ask a question about, you know, care's relationship to creativity, but also this idea of kind of limitation and exhaustion, and like, what are the lines of the self, you know, and how those are sort of navigated, you know, navigating those sort of parameters or setting parameters around those relationships. And to draw one more connection, I'm also thinking back to the Argonauts, Maggie, and this idea of, like, you know, language and plenitude, and the idea that, you know, words maybe are good enough, you know, but then also this idea of a kind of an economy of words too, and what can be expressed and what cannot be expressed. So I know that's a bit meandering, and it certainly is building on the person whose question I'm kind of riffing off here, but I'll leave it there. Maybe that sparks some thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I had, the question is, I printed these out that said, do you ever feel exhausted by art? How do you keep yourselves open to the creative experience when you're feeling fatigued from the creative expressions and institutions around you? I mean, I think, I don't know if it's quite the same question, but like, I don't feel like I feel, one can get exhausted by anything, which can just be meaning like you're in the museum and like you've just seen enough that day or whatever, or like you didn't eat and now your like blood sugar's low or whatever. Like, I don't know that I'm ever exhausted by art, like in the abstract. The institutions and the crap that surrounds everything, like I think, when you were talking before, Mark, about like feeling swaddled by my book or all the care, all like the bibliographic notes or something, there's like all that, and then, something I've thought about quite a bit this past fall and even into the spring in other countries as I kind of do a lot of talking about the book, is that there's a different art, which is like the art of the gloss or the art of pulling things out from your work to make them able to travel in like a podcast or on the radio or whatever. And that, is not the art I've spent my life practicing. I spent my art practicing the other art, which is like the in the weeds art. But I find the latter pretty exhausting. However, I think of it as just a spiritual practice to try and, respect yourself when you're exhausted, but also then, be curious about everything. So I've also tried to become more curious about how, if I'm going to participate in something, how can I learn this new art? How can I learn things about it that instead of exhausting me, I can, imagine it as a challenge. Art that's really gray in the world, if your blood sugar is not too low or whatever, or like, your partner didn't just leave you, or you didn't just get a bad diagnosis or whatever, like even then, art can be, I think I go to art as per that little piece that Denise read, I've always gone to it with the hopes of feeling re-inspired to be recommitted to something about living, and it doesn't happen all the time. It's nothing happens all the time, it's kind of like Russian roulette. But I think that I wouldn't keep going to it if I didn't think of it as a source, I don't know, Mark, if you have thoughts on.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think what you're saying totally makes sense. And I think I was definitely exhausted when I moved up here, but I don't know if it was like literally exhausted in art making or just trying to like sort of navigate my way through like what was going on, because there were so many external voices in my head and sort of like figuring out how to sort that out. But I think more what I learned was sort of how to not be exhausted and realize that everything I was doing, like from going to thrift stores and watching bad TV and then taking long walks in the woods, and that they all were kind of part of my practice in a way that I had probably never let myself do, but like bring those things in before. And so I think I would get more exhausted by trying to sort of like make the work come, like sort of like try and be like, okay, now I've set aside this time and I have to work. And I think, the only thing that's hard about sort of waiting for work to be revealed is a lot less exhausting, but it doesn't go on your schedule either. And it can take a really long time. And I also think when, I had a sort of a mentor helping me when I moved up here, and they said, you have to be really aware, Mark, like what you're doing is really great for you spiritually, and it's working really well ultimately towards, probably your creativity and everything else in your life, but it's going to look a lot like failure to other people, and especially your peers in the art world. And it did. I think in some ways, but I think sort of at that time it's very different now, but even 8 years ago it was sort of like moving upstate was like you were giving up, you were like, you kind of were like, oh yeah, I don't know where they are. I don't know if they still make work. They like moved upstate or something, So I don't know if that, yeah, I just tried to be balanced in
I love the
general if I
words
can.
career suicide because like they've been leveled at me a few times, and every time it's leveled, I think something good's about to happen. What
Yeah,
happened is in fact career suicide,
yeah, yeah. And I
I mean,
also think like in certain ways, I become exhausted when I'm like super excited about my work and I can't stop working on it. I don't think there's just an exhaustion in a bad way, in a certain way, because sometimes I get so excited I can't really sleep and I'm making notes all night and then I'm in the studio and I deplete myself, but in the best kind of ways, I think too.
yeah, one of the best pieces of advice that anyone ever gave me about work was when I was saying something like, I'm bored by it, then I hate it, then I'm excited. And then somebody said, a writer friend of mine said, well, why would you want to devote your life to any pursuit that only made you feel one way, which just seemed to me like, of course, like writing, whether it's, meditation, parenting, anything, like, why would you devote, it's not going to feel one way, and exhaustion is one of the ways that it's going to feel. Yeah.
I remember you talked about Amy Silman quite a few times in the book, I know, and Amy was a professor of mine in graduate school. And I remember Amy saying this thing that I still think of all the time. Amy said so many things that I still think of all the time, but one of the things Amy said is you spend your sort of younger years as an artist, like, stomping your feet, sort of demanding, like, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, look at me, look what I'm doing. And then everybody starts looking. And she said, and that's when the really hard part starts.
Yeah.
Because then you have people's attention and you're not just sort of like, going at it with this like compulsive sort of thing where you can't, it's just, it's like has your grip on you. But when people start looking, that's when things, I think, got exhausting in a certain way, because for a lot of different reasons for me.
I think we have a somewhat related question that came in just now from someone in the audience. I like how it connects on the level of creative process. Someone asked, is there a stage for each of you in your creative process where you introduce criticality as a form of care? Can such a form of care for criticality be thought of as radical? And then there's a related question too, which is many juxtapose criticality and care. For example, if you are critical of others, you must not care for them. How would you challenge and respond to this notion? So, yeah.
Well, no, that's a good sigh. It's not like I just more like a sigh, like how much time do we have? I mean, I think there's actually a line in On Freedom where I directly say that I'm postulating what I'm calling a kind of weak theory, a kind of long, rigorous look at the word care as a form of care, even though I'm, precisely not participating in the kind of like sloganeering or like activist pragmatism that would use the word in that way. I was more interested in like offering a genealogy of it, looking at its feminist roots, like imagining its relationship with control and coercion, like reminding ourselves about, as we're talking about today, like the economy of care in all senses, both as a limited, not always limited, but in some spheres limited quantity, but also its relationship to an actual economy. I mean, so many things, right, that we've thought about. And I think that in certain, not all for sure, not like in this kind of a forum, but, in certain forums, I've just noted, there's a lot of anxiety right now, as it makes sense, because in any time when the brutalities of the time feel so obvious and so urgent and so painful, that to be critical of like, I don't mean critical like judgmental, that maybe we'll get to the second question later. I mean critical like what I think of as like the job of the critic, which is like what I just said, genealogies, history, skepticism, all of that, I performed that in my book towards not only care, towards freedom, towards consent, towards many concepts. And I don't, so I think right now, because of the anxiety that there can be about that, and because of the hunger that there can be for the work of critics to be doing something that feels more like that uses the tools of activism more properly, I think that there can be a kind of, frustration with that work. But, I consider that my work, and I don't consider it at odds with like my convictions. And I think that they can all coexist together. And, as speaking of things people had said, like, Fred Moten, I remember once said, someone was saying something, why can't people do something? And then he just said, we don't all have to do the same thing. like everything that we're doing, people can do a different part of it, which is, I think, why the CARE syllabus and the way that you guys have organized it is so great, is that you're showing all these ways that everybody can kind of do, kind of play a different part. I'm like making this because I'm imagining like a daisy or something, like a flower. And it's like, I think it's really important to, in my kind of endless drive towards recognizing heterogeneity and allowing like difference without separation or separability, to use like De Silva's terms, is that like we don't all have to do the same thing, and that the work of the work of care that criticality does is one kind of work. It's not the only work, but I think it's it's one that I feel, not even all the times for me, sometimes I feel a more lyric pull or a different pull, but like in this particular most recent project, that was the pull.
Yeah, it's I just looked up criticality because I was like, I don't know if I know the definition of that, which is really interesting. Both things I found said it's the operation of a nuclear reactor. Criticality is the state when the nuclear chain reaction becomes self-sustaining. So, I mean, in a way that was sort of, I don't mean to, I'm not trying to be flip. I was literally just, sometimes I do that when I'm not exactly sure. I know the word criticality, but I was like, I actually don't know the definition of it. I mean, in certain ways, I think I'm always kind of bringing it in throughout, I mean, I think when you're, I think this idea of what's necessary, is kind of like always at a certain point. I think when I started getting into my work, it was when it stopped being sort of illustrative, it was a lot more like what's actually necessary, and what's here. And I think for me in this work, there was just a sense of this being a place that like something like climate change and AIDS were just such big things that, but especially with climate change, I feel like there is a sort of like people asked me right away when I was doing the exhibition, like, was I going to make everything out of recycled materials, and was I going to use paper mache instead of foam? And I was sort of like running this around in my head, and in a very critical way of sort of thinking about like, should I do this? Is these things in theory are supposed to last forever? How much of a carbon footprint does this one Starbucks have on one day compared to like what I'm making? And I sort of came to the conclusion that the only thing I could actually do that might reverse anything was just have the space be dark, and have nothing in it. And sort of that way, that would be the only way I could actually reverse anything, at least like remove the carbon footprint of the lights for 9 months. But I decided that wasn't the work that I wanted to do and the comment I wanted to make. And I think in a certain way, especially with climate change, with talking with Ed and Susanna earlier, like we were talking about maybe doing some programming, that there was going to maybe be an actual disco thing or something. And I was kind of like, I don't want to have a disco unless we have some sort of like climate trauma, maybe workshops going on for a few months, and then it can culminate in a disco. And then someone else suggested, oh, and we can have people there sort of suggesting how people what they can do about climate change, what sort of actions they could take. And I sort of, in the way of the deer, I felt really allergic. I was like, oh, no, we can't do that here. This is an emotional space for people. This is a space for people to sort of process trauma, process these things, so they can sort of get to a place where maybe they can move into sort of like change, like actually working. But I think for me, I had to sort of like, I think you have to like sort of feel what you're actually feeling and deal with those emotions before you can move on to the action of it. And so that's kind of a space that I haven't really seen that much, that I wanted to create in an art space where people could just sort of like feel how they feel about these things without sort of me trying to tell them actions they needed to take right now. You know what I mean? If that makes sense. The action would be, in a way, a kind of self-care. I mean, I don't think I can like sort of enact self-care on anybody, but sort of creating a space that I felt like for me could be a contemplative space where I can think about these things and start through this theatrical distance specifically to then sort of process it in a way that then I can move forward with it. That would hopefully be about actually a solution, maybe, you know. I don't know if that makes sense. But.
Thank you. I want to just remind folks that if they want to join for a bit more informal discussion following this discussion right now, you can email info@carouselbis.org and we'll send you a link to a Zoom room. But I want to close out here with one more question. And Maggie, you just mentioned Fred Moten, who I know is an important interlocutor in On Freedom. You're touching on Moten's work in many places there, and Moten has also been a kind of, you know, some of his ideas have been, you know, particularly guiding in the creation of Carousel Abyss, and particularly in thinking about collaboration. And how collaboration has become a really important way, and as Fred Moten has spoken about in certain places, for him to create and for him to practice criticism and to be a critic. And I also see, you know, collaboration, at least thinking with others on the page, has been, you know, is you know, as sort of the heart of a lot of your work as well. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, you know, the many folks that you're in conversation with on Freedom, and you know, how with this sort of keyword freedom, you know, how that process of thinking with others on the page and sort of, you know, doing that work of being the critic and thinking through those lineages of care and those histories of care, you know, what that process has been like for you, and who are, you know, some of those folks whose thinking has been, you know, important to the process.
Well, I always get kind of insecure in talking about the collaboration issue, especially around Fred, because Fred has, I think, you know, has been one of those people who've, in addition to kind of theorizing, thinking with others on the page, and in addition to his own writings, you know, citational kind of drift and immersion, you know, with Stefano Harney, but also with, you know, many others, you know, Fred, I think, has become more and more interested in, you know, in bringing that, what was always a fantasy of singular authorship into something that is more, you know, explicitly not, you know, singular authorship, either with someone else's, you know, what was that? Are we okay? Are we okay, Kevin? Are we okay? All right.
I think we're okay, Kevin. If yeah,
Okay.
we're good.
It was funny. It was like the pizza came. Anyway, like, I think I get insecure because I think that, like, Fred is somebody who basically has done a lot of collaborations and is more and more interested in the word bleeding out in a much more explicit way into collaborative labor, whereas I'm not. I don't know if it's. I think I don't want to theorize about why, but I just, you know, I'm a pretty social person, but I'm not social in the same way. And I think that part of, again, you know, back to the whole not having to do everything the same way, I think that a book like On Freedom, you know, in addition to thinking aloud with a lot of others, you know, a lot of the others that I'm thinking with, some are dead, you know, some are ancestors, some are, but many are friends. And in a weird way, why the book doesn't have, and why I kind of agitated for it not to have any blurbs or any kind of apparatus. I mean, I felt like I was lucky enough to have just kind of, on my 10th book, I felt like I'd earned it. Like, don't make me ask anyone for anything. But then secondly, it was because everybody was already in there, you know, and everybody who I was talking to was already in there, and all my friends were already in there. And I felt like all of that was already enough. So I guess all I'm trying to say is there are forms of sociality, like friendship, that undergird a lot of the things that I do, but that I'm not always making explicit in certain ways. And, you know, who knows, I may do more explicitly collaborative work in the future. But I think, you know, what we're doing now, I mean, everything about, I mean, I always kind of say like writing is both the most asocial thing I do in my whole life, you know, like because it's the only thing I do where I desperately close the door of the room, whereas most of my life I'm caring for other people, or as a teacher or a parent, or, you know, being in partnership, or being, you know, another, whatever sociality there is with COVID, you know, trying to be in it. But it's also the most social thing I do, and that it's brought me into the most conversations that I wouldn't have if I hadn't been a writer. So I think it's that kind of, you know, not any one thing. Like I think it's really important, like Mark was talking about, to spend that time. It's an illusion that it's single self time when you like close the door, but it is important, I think, to kind of try and sum a bunch of things up for what Mark was talking about the experience with the sculpture on the university campus. You also need a time where you're not holding other people's feelings and in active reaction to them while you're trying to figure out what you think. And I don't think if you don't give yourself that time, then as Mark says, I don't think that the work is honest. And I don't think that it also takes any risks, because it's still trying to modulate itself based on other people's reactivity, based on things you want to think through. So I think so I think there is this play between, I wouldn't call it really like asocial, but I would definitely call it, a kind of superficial solitary labor that needs to take place for me. And then I appreciate all the social engagement that it brings, you know.
Thanks, Mark. Do you want to add anything as we close out here?
I guess collaboration, I feel like is one of those words these days that is sort of like curation, or it gets thrown around so much and really casually compared to what I used to think of a collaboration was. So the way it is now, I feel like I'm collaborating with all my influences all the time, and you know, Maggie's book I love so much, and I was making it, like listening to it as literally as I was making my work, and it was influencing me. So it's like, I don't know, not to be too like esoteric, like I feel like I'm collaborating with people all the time, but I do feel like that. I feel like I've always felt like there's sort of this loose web of people that I've always been sort of connected to, and then I'm influenced by them, and then I might meet them later, or I meet people who knew them if they're not here anymore, and then and so I've kind of always felt a little bit like that. But I've done a number of like true collaborations with people. Right now, Jack Ferber I've done like two full collaborations with Jack, but they're now going to perform in this piece, and it won't be a collaboration, and that's for logistical reasons and other reasons, but we're definitely working super closely together on it. So, you know, I think again that word is different, and I think Maggie just summed it up really well with sort of like it's like this sort of very solitary and very social thing at the same time, and you know, it's also collaborative and singular at the same time, and yeah, I just think there's a real flow to it to me these days. I try not to define a lot of those things as much.
Well, for all the things it may mean, I'm very grateful that, you know, we were able to have this collaborative dialogue. Thank you so much, Maggie and Mark. This has really been wonderful. And again, if anyone would like to join for a bit more discussion, I invite you to email info@caresyllabus.org. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Maggie. It's great.
Thank you guys. Absolutely.